Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center and our conversation today, which is focused on the jewel of America's energy innovation system, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, or ARPA-E. I'm Sasha Mackler, the director of the BPC's Energy Project. For more than a decade, the BPC and its project, the American Energy Innovation Council, have been working on the case that our national energy innovation system is central to maintaining America's global competitiveness and must be focused on developing the clean energy technologies of the future in order to support an adequate set of solutions to the climate challenge. ARPA-E is a central part of this strategy. From its enabling legislation in the America Competes Act of 2007 to its first appropriation in 2009, ARPA-E has grown to an agency that now has a budget of over $400 million annually. And over the course of the last decade, it's made a tremendous impact on the energy system. And very importantly, the recent Energy Act of 2020 that was just signed into law at the end of the last Congress reauthorized the agency on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis with a plan to grow its budget to $761 million by 2025. BPC has been a strong supporter, ally, and partner all along the way. Amidst the political divisions around climate change and the increasing polarization in Washington, D.C., we must remind ourselves that progress and work continues. ARPA-E has carefully managed to maintain a steady bipartisan support system in Washington and across the country, and maintaining a keen focus on innovation and risk. Anyone who's working in this field appreciates that this is a tricky task. Today's conversation is geared towards looking back at the agency's impact and its successes, as well as looking ahead to the larger opportunities, constraints, and challenges that it will face. How should the agency grow and evolve in the years ahead? We couldn't have assembled a better group today to explore these issues than the panelists we have here. ARPA-E's current director, Elaine Jantowski, a Republican appointee, is here with us. In addition, we have Dave Danielson, a former Democratic appointee at the Department of Energy under President Obama, who was there at the beginning. He was initially ARPA-E's first employee. My close colleague, Addison Stark, who manages the BPC Innovation Program and is also a part of ARPA-E's history, which I know he will share, will be moderating the conversation. We're expecting a lively chat today and encourage all of those watching to weigh in with your own questions and comments. But first, I want to thank our speakers for joining us today and you, our audience, for engaging as well. With that, I'll turn things over to Addison to kick off the discussion. Thanks.
Sasha, thanks very much. And exactly as you said, we couldn't have assembled a better panel to talk with us today about RPE. So as you mentioned, we have two panelists today. The first I'll introduce is the current director of RPE, Elaine Jantowski. Prior to joining RPE, he served as a senior advisor to the Undersecretary of Science at the Department of Energy. Before entering government service, he was the founder and managing director of Dividend Income Advisors, an energy and power investment firm. And he had, prior to that, a career across Wall Street, working in the power sector, doing investments in multiple firms, including Wells Fargo Securities, JP Morgan Chase, and Bank of America. Additionally, we have, as Sasha mentioned, Dave Danielson joining us. He's managing director at Breakthrough Energy Ventures, a $1 billion fund focused on fighting climate change by investing in clean energy innovation. He was previously served as assistant secretary for EERE in the U.S. Department of Energy, and he was the first hire at RPE. As an aside, we actually got to know each other even before that at MIT, where we both started our careers in energy. Dave also serves as a pre-court energy scholar at Stanford University, where he teaches a course in clean energy entrepreneurship. So with that, thank you both for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Great to be here.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and jump in. Sasha set us up well. We have a lot to talk about. RPE is now entering its 12th year of existence, and we've seen a year of challenges, of success, and a kind of a culmination over time. In particular, a lot of these innovations have taken the decade to start to really see the successes that we are starting to see is really important to measure. So, Lane, I'll turn to you first and ask you, tell me a little bit about 2020 at RPE. It seems like it was a year of challenges and yet many successes.
Well, 2020 was an interesting year. The challenge to us in ARPA-E was to keep our principal investigators working. We had no problem being in Washington. The Congress has been very supportive and given us, through both parties, plenty of money. We revamped a lot of internal processes to make sure that we spent it rapidly and wisely, got the money into people's hands, and supported where we can the investigators out in the field. We started new projects. We started the Scale Up project, which is taking prior ARPA awardees and trying to move them along to production and into the marketplace. We put $75 million up against that. We were originally going to put 50, and then we got over $1 billion worth of applications. So we ended up adding the money from 50 to 75, and then there'll be an announcement sometime shortly on some awards, some more awards in that program. And we plan to do it again this year in 2021. Taking the people and, Dave's got something really interesting called the Unicorn Index that he's going to introduce, which I'll let him get to on his own. But we've also got a push and a tug, as we do, since we kind of work for Congress underneath their statute. We've got a push and a tug to do things and avoid the valley of death that they speak about. So this program is meant to avoid the valley of death and give people some tangible interim progress on projects that we think have plenty of promise. We've spent, in terms of getting money out the door, and there's always investigators that want to get money out the door, as do the congressmen. We spent more in the last 2 years than we've done in any 3 years. And that results in the focus from the congressional office about giving us the budget, and it also reflects in the focus of the staff on getting the contracts done, administering them quickly, and during the time of COVID, cutting back on some red tape that always grows, whatever organization you're in, red tape grows. So we tried to make it easy for the investigators to get the money, the project directors to push it through, and the investigators to have it, to keep the staffs working as best they can on the projects that they already have. So it was a good year. The increase in budget from the prior year was something like 16 or 17%. This year, the increase was only 2 or 3 million, but there was a lot of other money put to use. So I would say we've got plenty of new programs. We've got 4 or 5 new program directors in different areas. And we've also started partnerships with other areas of the US government and also with other governments in an attempt to bring in expertise in joint venture projects where we might not have it, might not have as much of it ourselves. And there I'm thinking about working with the ARPA entities in the UK on offshore wind. But it's been a good year. Everybody's been revising their operations to make it more efficient. And I look forward to next year for the agency.
Lane, thank you for that. And I think you're right. There's a couple of points that we'll probably pick out that you had highlighted there, in particular, talking a little bit more about the scale up FOA that you alluded to, focusing on the pilot and scale up challenges, and thinking about how we support these companies. But before that, I want to turn to Dave, because you were with the agency at the very beginning, maybe at a time that felt similar to the challenges of this year, building and making sure we can get money out the door quickly when it's most needed. And I'd love to hear your take on where RPE has come, how it started and how it's come to where it is today.
Yeah, Well, Addison, it's really good to be with you. And I remember our fun days at RPE, rolling up our sleeves in the trenches. Those were a lot of fun. And then I wanted to recognize, in light of recent events, how important the Bipartisan Policy Center's mission is. Thanks for doing what you're doing, and please keep doing it. And the American Energy Innovation Council has been crucial for the kind of support that we've seen for federal funding in, American energy innovation, RPE included. So, thank you so much for the great work you guys are doing and all the great folks that are involved. And by the way, Elaine and I we embody the bipartisan spirit. I think Elaine and I have developed a really strong COVID friendship. I'm trying to figure out if we've actually met in person, but we reach across the aisle and have a great relationship. And so, it's funny, right? Usually the quote unquote founder, I guess I consider myself a founder, co-founder of RPE. You're usually the biggest critic of the successors, right? Because hey, the thing I started, we did it right at the beginning, and those kind of things. And I've had a chance to be under the hood of RPE quite a bit over the last year, and I got a chance tomorrow to spend some more time with the team. And I guess one thing that I have to say is that the state of RPE is very, very strong, and so it's exciting to see that. I think to some extent the ARPA-E model is and must be simple, right? It's really, in many ways, you want to be as close to the DARPA model as you can, because that's what really works. And I remember when we started at the beginning, our motto was WWDD, what would DARPA do? And I can see that Lane and his team have really done that well while innovating things like scale up, and a number of other things. I think doing a lot of really innovative stuff and really trying to improve processes, like Lane said, can creep up on you in an organization. I do think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that one big learning I had in Washington is that every year you get a layer of bureaucracy in any new in any organization, and so, especially the federal government. And so really working hard to peel those back proactively, as Lane was talking about, is really important. I think that's something we should stay vigilant on. But here in year 10, it's pretty amazing the kind of success that we're seeing out of ARPA-E and some of the early projects. And this is a long game, right? This is a multi-decadal game of transforming the energy system. And really ARPA-E's role is analogous to DARPA, is to create transformational new fields, transformational new industries. Right, our RPE should be judged by its greatest successes, not by its average or its worst outcomes as it relates to projects. And 10 years is not that long in the context of that transformational innovation. But what I've been excited to see is even within 10 years, we're seeing some really great indicators of success and some real impact from the work that has been funded on a bipartisan basis by RPE. And there was an interesting paper in Nature Energy not too long ago by a friend of mine, Anna Goldstein, trying to kind of get a sense for that 10-year impact. And that gave me motivation to kind of dig in to the numbers and what was going on, and really, roll up my sleeves and call a bunch of former folks I worked with in companies, and just to get a sense for where things were. And that really did it did really remind me of how important it is to keep in mind that RPE is about these transformational upside, big outcomes, right? And so it made me think, what are the right outcomes? And so, as Lane mentioned, one metric that I thought would be interesting for us all to think about as one that, there are going to be multiple that we should think about that we would measure RPE's success against. But I have one that Lane mentioned that I would put forward, called the ARPA-E Unicorn Index. And essentially this is, how many $1 billion plus valued companies did RPE have a really important role playing with at the very beginning, right? So RPE definitively had a big impact on enabling these companies to exist. If you look, how many of those exist, and what total market value do those companies have? And, because in the RPE mission space, it's all about getting things deployed commercially, right? Because it's the private sector that really deploys these innovations, not the public sector. And I identified 3 separate RPE originated kind of technologies and companies that have achieved $1 billion plus valuation that has been stated publicly. And one is QuantumScape, which was a project that RPE funded, I think, back in 2009, 2010 out of Stanford University that spun out into a company and developing a transformational technology called all solid state lithium metal batteries, which by my estimate is kind of end game technology for electric vehicles. And that company tackled hard problems with that initial start from RPE, and now it has gone public and has achieved phenomenal technical breakthroughs and is worth well over $20 billion today. And a couple other companies, Sila Nanotechnologies, an exciting battery materials company, which is really pushing the envelope, and another company, Ginkgo Bioworks, which is one of the leading synthetic biology companies, which they're tackling all kinds of interesting challenges like decarbonizing fertilizer and biofuels and things like that. And those two companies are both worth, in the case of Sila, it's been publicly reported it's worth more than $1 billion. In the case of Ginkgo, it's been publicly reported it's more than $4 billion. And so I think the last count I had is that index is at about $28 billion today. And when I compare that to a little over $3 billion that's been invested in the agency to date, that's a pretty impressive number. And I think it's indicative of emerging success and a lot more to come.
I think that's a really interesting metric, and I know that Lane had mentioned it before, this idea of looking at the biggest successes. And you're right that, when we talk about the foundational principle of, high risk, high reward investments that RPE should be focusing on. Lane, I'd love to turn back to you and think about, from your days in the private sector, how do you think about some of these companies coming out from RPE? Is this the right metric to think about, the market caps of what we're investing in?
Well, in the private sector, I guess you think that everything is a success if it raises money. But I think the general nature of the agency is to fund breakthroughs, and to fund breakthroughs in an industry that by its nature has got to be conservative and reliable. I mean, before you put something on a grid, it's got to get tested by a million different agencies in the states and in the federal government for reliability, for dependability, for use for the use intended. It's got to get a certificate of public convenience and necessity. So there's a lot of things that go through that tell you it will be added slowly, because what you don't want to do is add something and then have it break, so to speak, or not work. I will say that part of everybody knows who works with me and tries to get money out of me, that they come in with their proposal and they have to pitch the proposal through various layers. But then I take out the statute and I read the statute each and every time. And now I've gone so far as to asking the general counsel to give me his written opinion that it in fact satisfies the elements of the statute to make sure we don't get carried away with ourselves. And one of the quirky elements of the statute, the goal is a goal to enhance, efficiency and reduce greenhouse gases, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of people miss goal B, which is where a lot of the things come in, and that is to ensure we maintain a technological lead in developing and deploying. So one of the things that we try to focus on with the scale-up program, and one of the things that the tech-to-market people focus on individual projects is, okay, looks great, satisfies a need, it's going to be efficient, it'll stand on its own economically, it'll do a superior job, it'll address a need. Will it be deployable? And that kind of gets conflated with the idea of the valley of death. Many of these things go in the valley of death, and maybe they should belong there, or maybe they should languish there, and we do not feed them. We feed the ones that can get out of the valley of death, that'll give us breakthroughs. So it's a question of sometimes allocating, as you both know, follow-on funding, plus-ups on projects. But certainly the deploying language has been used and focused on to avoid the quote-unquote valley of death. And I think that we've got constituencies that care just about the science, constituencies that care about deploying and getting through the valley of death, and a goal or a constituency that cares about the unicorn result. And I think the primary result that we're driving at is the unicorn result. We're looking to do a breakthrough. But by the same token, we have all this knowledge and all this research and all the needs that have to be addressed. And sometimes, we just need something simple like a lightweight medium voltage cable that's going to be used in someone else's electronic aviation program. And it's not going to be in and of itself revolutionary, but it's important. And we can't go cluttering up airframes with heavy cables. So we kind of, we don't have the unifying or the focusing need for the money payout at the end of the unicorn. I think we've got some things along the way that we have to pay attention to. So sometimes we get sort of diverted from that. But the primary goal is large breakthroughs, and the secondary goal is to make sure we're constantly moving forward knowledge and the availability of that knowledge embodied in product to the customers that use them, to the taxpayers that pay.
So certainly, Lane, I agree that these commercialization metrics are critical. However, we think about some of the lessons we can learn from the failures, and I think there also is, going back to what Dave pointed out that was in that Nature Energy article, is there are other metrics I think that might be important when we think about how RPE pushes the energy innovation field forward. So besides the really big unicorn metrics, which are crucial, what are some of the other things? I remember thinking about, the importance of kind of bringing the scientific learnings to the community. Are there other metrics?
Sure.
That you
Well,
guys
actually, we've just started we have a brand new associate director of technology, Ishik Yaki, and Ishik is focused like a laser beam on patents. The importance of patents in the system, the importance of documenting your discoveries and your advances with patent filing. And I was just on a phone with him on the RPE program yesterday on the first annual meeting. And RPE is a program that uses a depositional technology to put lack of a better term, a kind of a lining on low pressure LDC gas pipes to avoid excavation and replace crumbling gas pipes and stop methane leak. And he hammered these folks 2 or 3 times, and he's on his second session today, to make sure that what they do is patented so that it can be shared and it can be used as quickly as possible. We have other goals. We have other metrics for success. And clearly, I think that we've been focused on commercialization, and now I think we're adding to that. And of course, the answer is you have to be focused on everything, right? It's just difficult to be focused on everything every day. So that's, I guess, why we have a team. So these days, Ishik is quite focused on patents, and he's not going to let them get away. He's a good manager.
Dave, any other thoughts on important metrics we should be thinking about for the broader innovation context?
Yeah, long game is really like DARPA. 30 years from now, we should be talking about the energy equivalent of, the internet and stealth and self-driving cars and drones and many other things that have come out of DARPA. And so I think that winning is really going to be that, I think, in the decades ahead, and I can see that happening. And to be honest, I already see some glimmers of areas where RPE was ahead of the curve and was doing things before other people in the private sector or even innovators out in universities and national labs were thinking much about them. And I think those, to me, include, I think RPE has had a really big impact on these solid state batteries, which I think could be end game technology for EVs. It's been really exciting to see RPE is way ahead of the curve on long duration storage, storing energy on a seasonal basis. where you're not looking at the daily cycle of the sun, but the annual cycle of the Earth around the sun. When we have a ton of really cheap wind and solar, that's going to become really important. So they've kind of fostered a whole field, right? Not just supporting companies, but fostered a whole new field. Electrofuels is another one. Nobody was talking about electrofuels 10 years ago, and now it's on everybody's lips because wind and solar are so cheap. Hydrogen and other vectors for getting fuels out of renewable electricity. And something that's maybe not so sexy is wide bandgap power electronics is something that's going to be ubiquitous in the modern energy industry, and is going to be truly enabling. And so I can already see in year 10 glimmers of what some of those might be. And then ultimately it's about adoption and impact and revenues. I saw a good question in the chat from a member of the audience that it's really about kind of emissions avoided by virtue of products sold, or revenues, or imported energy reduction. But I think in the meanwhile, I think the value of kind of category defining companies that in these completely new breakthrough areas is a pretty good proxy. And then they're the necessary things, like these guys better be raising funding and moving forward. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. But I do think those kind of the private sector metrics matter a lot, because energy is a private sector game, right?
Yeah, and Dave raises a good point for the audience. We will be taking audience questions, so please submit them. Whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, you can submit questions. I will be collecting those and asking them of our panelists. So thank you for that reminder. But Dave, one thing I'd ask you then and now is to think about it, instead of, like you're talking about before, being one of the founders who looks at RPE as something where you think, you have an intimate knowledge, instead using the hat of you as a venture investor in energy now. How do you look at RPE as being an actor, as kind of is it a first pass band gap for like looking at companies? Is it something that's more creating energy and these new fields, these new focus types of industries? What do you think of the role of RPE from the investor side?
Yeah, so I'm an investor at Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a well over $1 billion investment, climate tech venture investment fund and group backed by Bill Gates and more than 24 other kind of global energy and business leaders. And we're somewhat, we're on the edge of being willing to go early and take a lot of risk, I would say, right? But it's been exciting to see 2 or 3 years ago, there was very little activity on the private side, on the venture side, and now that has really grown a lot. And if you think about it, it's crucial that RPE was investing in this space, especially over the last few years, which were a bit of a valley of death for the space, that they were keeping the pipeline going in terms of innovation and early stage companies working on transformational approaches in energy. And so one of the things there are a couple of things that are really hard when you really get into the private sector seat. I'd say, one piece of context I want to put out there is, if by mid-century looking at, greenhouse gas emissions is one very important element of the mission, not the only one, of course, we got to get to, net zero by 2050. It's only 30 years away, right? And that's about, if you're going to go business as usual out to 2050 globally, that's maybe 80 gigatons per year of emissions. We're at about 50 today, and we got to get to zero. So that's 80 gigatons per year gap of a business as usual future versus the one that RPE and everyone on this call is looking to create. And for context, ExxonMobil is just, for the first time released their emissions footprint, and it's at 0.7 gigatons. So we're talking about 100 ExxonMobil's worth of need and economic opportunity there, right? And so we're going to need hundreds of breakthrough new companies, hundreds of Teslas, hundreds of QuantumScapes by 2050. And that means we got to be planting, thousands of seeds today, right? Because innovation in energy is a 30-year game to get to meaningful scale. And so I think that's an important context to keep in mind, that we need RPE to be planting tons and tons of seeds that a subset of which will turn into these breakthrough companies. And I have to admit, one of the most important areas for someone like Breakthrough is for you to be for RPE to be leading the field, right? So there are a bunch of areas out there where there's no other government funding for innovators to work on some of these problems, because it just, the kind of long-term roadmap-driven approach has not kind of caught up to some of these problems or hasn't attacked them. And so I would say things like, how are we going to decarbonize the really hard to decarbonize sectors like steel, concrete and cement, fertilizer, those kind of things are just examples. And how are we going to bridge, super cheap renewables to solve that problem? And there aren't often a lot of great innovations in the labs because no one's funding them from the public sector side. And so I think that we really rely on groups, the federal government, to plant those seeds and get innovators working on these really important white space hard problems in order to have something for us to go, an embryo that we can kind of grow into a company. And so like that is one area. And then I'm really excited to see Lane and the team do the scale up effort, because I would say from the private sector side, that's also probably one of the hardest moments and the most risky moments, is going from, hey, look, it works in the lab, and we got a prototype that's actually working, and now we got to go raise a pretty good chunk of capital to demonstrate it in the field as a pilot or do pilot manufacturing. That's probably the most difficult spot to raise capital. And so I think it's a very appropriate use of government funds to help mitigate that risk. And so those are a couple areas in the private sector seat that I really see RPE filling and playing an absolutely crucial role, last 10 years and the next 10, 20, 30 years, to be candid.
Well, having been there, both of you, one of the things we have to know is that but for the ARPA money, the project might not have gone as deeply and as large as it could have. And that's a finding that we have to make on all of these things and incorporate private money with it. We just did a battery project using Prussian blue in the battery and for quick charge and quick discharge. And we gave out our largest single ARPA award at $19.5 million on scale up. So that would have been hard to raise in addition to the people that raised the other money, which was in essence another $25 million. So, not that 25 is easy, but 50 is harder at that stage. So we're happy to push in on that. I saw someone say something about focusing on, in the notes, focusing on revenue as a value as opposed to capital. And I guess in the public sector, for many of these companies that are now coming out, they won't have meaningful revenues or EBITDA for some years, but they do have a value. So sometimes putting revenue as a metric for standing on its own is not available. And sometimes capitalization is just as important a metric to focus you in on what you have to do with them and the role you have to play. So since people get priced without revenue, we value them without revenue, just the way the market does.
Right, and Lane was referring to a question that came from Mark Johnson. What RPE projects have resulted in the greatest revenues to date? That seems perhaps to be a better metric of adoption than market capitalization. I know that both of you referred to that question, so I just wanted to give a hat tip to the audience there. And let's turn to a couple of these other questions because they are coming in. And so the next one I wanted to ask is something that's relevant to the energy reauthorization, or the RPE reauthorization that just happened. There's been a couple of changes in the language. A first question came from Paul Dickman, and he asked, in the new authorization, RPE's purview is including environmental management and cleanup. How are you thinking about that, Lane? What is the role of RPE in thinking about this broader area?
That's new. Staff members have been talking about it for a while. I think it has to be first interpreted under the umbrella of ARPA's purpose and statute, which is a research organization. I don't think anybody's looking for ARPA to go out and basically duplicate environmental management and start putting cleanup crews on the ground out in Richland, right? That's something that's part of the science and the EM division. under Undersecretary DeBar, and that's handled there. As far as the research goes, we have people who are capable to do it, but of course, before they're capable, they have to develop project proposals and get project proposals vetted, and then budget amounts have to be allocated. So I would say, how are we prepared now? We're fully funded and fully committed in terms of our scientific talent. We'll have to sit down and think about what we're going to do. I think the next ARPA director will have to sit down with their secretary or their deputy secretary and sit down with the committees and decide exactly what they intended to mean by that, and then get it in the budget and spool up some project. It's not directly related, but you could argue that it's within the mitigation of pollution, clarifies or elaborates on the mitigation of pollution power that's in the basic ARPA statute. So that's a to be determined, and I think probably a year or two down the road before any kind of approach is made to it. Dave, do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on something. I know we've got some great folks from the Hill and from some of the really important nonprofit organizations that do a lot of the important kind of background research to inform policy dialogues. One thing I want to make really, really clear, having been someone really close to what the magic of ARPA-E is, it's really, really important that all of us fight to have ARPA-E have as much flexibility as it can possibly have to, for the program directors and the director to identify those opportunities that are out there over the horizon that are really great bets, for programs that could result in transformational outcomes. And I think the death of ARPA-E would be if Congress started basically kind of dictating at a granular level the topics that ARPA-E works on. And so, having more flexibility in the statute, I think is great. But it's really important that Congress really and the staffers and the community understand that ideally we should have one budget line for ARPA-E, and we shouldn't specify anything below that, because it all unravels when you do that. The essence of ARPA-E is risk taking and bringing in really high talent program directors. And the way you do that is by, when I was recruiting for ARPA-E, I remember saying, hey, come to the government for a few years, change the world. You'll have order of magnitude $60 million to develop transformational programs of your own design if you can convince your colleagues and the director that they're worthy programs. And that brings in super high talent. And that flexibility allows that talent to do great things. If you start specifying what ARPA-E is going to do at a granular level, that talent won't come in and the transformational programs won't happen. So that was one thing. I think if there's one point I would want to get across in this discussion, that would be it. Because that is the nexus point of the value creation at ARPA-E.
Dave, I think that's a really great point, and I appreciate you making it. It's certainly something that a lot of the NGO community around DC has thought about, and it's really good to highlight that for what kind of blue sky innovation to occur, you need to have a blue sky mandate. As long as, exactly like Lane pointed out, we're hitting those original mandates, the original parts of the authorization and what we're trying to do as ARPA-E. So turning to another question on here that I think is helpful, and we start thinking about ARPA-E in the future and what is the role of ARPA-E in innovating to address climate change. There was a question from People's Squire. ARPA-E now has under its remit to improvements to energy infrastructure as part of the new authorization. What do we think about that as kind of the role about ARPA-E, not just on the individual widgets, but the broader energy kind of system challenges as we move forward?
Well, if I can take that, we've got a fair number of grid projects today uh, undergoing. And we've got a particularly interesting program that results in the distribution and of existing electric generating. One of the projects called Perform, one of the project directors indicated he thought that he could get another 10 or 12% out of the Cal ISO in terms of dispatchable output and ease up the brownouts and ease up the direction from which the power is coming. The best kind of additional megawatts you can get is the ones that are already built and are clean power to dispatch them more efficiently, dispatch them more regularly. So you don't build more, you don't burn more fuel, you just get another 10% out of what you got, let's say. So I think that we're very focused on that. In point of fact, the gentleman from Berkeley, who was the auction designer that won the Nobel Prize this year in economics, he's one of the lead investigators on our project to design a better dispatch and auctioning system to get power from existing power plants and prioritize clean power, get it from existing power plants into consumers in peak times, and no more build. So I think the best news is if you can put an algorithm in place and you have the wires that can stand the load, put an algorithm in place that can get you another 10% off your ISO output, you've immediately avoided building power plants, which cost money and time and releases carbon into the atmosphere. All the steel you make and all the cement you pour all adds to the carbon in the atmosphere. And you aim it at clean power and you dispatch better. So I think that we're highly interested in that program, and we funded it at a very high level.
Yeah, Addison, I think I saw an interesting question around what does ARPA-C mean? And I think that's a really interesting topic for the community to be discussing. And I think, as Lane mentioned, energy-related emissions are in the statute, right? And so I think that it's good for us to think about what can RPE not do today under its statutory authority that is important to address climate. That I think it's something to be studied deeply, of course, but I think from a breakthrough perspective, having been an energy person for a couple decades and then coming into a climate-focused organization, one of the big new things was the emissions associated with food, agriculture, and land use. And so I think that's probably one area that is, energy touches everything. So maybe there is a connection, but I think that's kind of one of the sectors that probably comes into play when you're thinking about a C versus E. And maybe some areas like
I'm going to just jump in quickly, Dave, since people aren't seeing these directly. There was a question from Julia Farber asking that Biden's policy plan states the desire to create an ARPA-C, or C standing for climate, to focus on climate-specific technologies not covered by RPE. So this is an important point that you're raising, and thinking about what are the things beyond the E, that although energy does touch everything. And RPE has gotten involved with a lot of these things, but these are really important questions. So excuse me for interrupting. Just wanted to clarify for the audience.
Right. And so things like, forest maintenance or soil carbon or, the emissions from heating up limestone and to make cement, there are definitely a number of areas out there, and, or something like, reducing radiative forcing, kind of like getting less heat into the atmosphere, which is somewhat controversial area. There are definitely a few areas out there I think that would be a stretch for RPE to address, without changes to some language. But I think that especially I'd say that food ag land use area is probably one of the big ones that would have to be thought about.
Yeah, Lane.
I should admit we have 2 ag programs and a cement program, and we're just about to fund someone who's pushing heat up into space. So I guess they were lucky they got a liberal arts graduate to interpret the statute.
I actually think there's quite a bit of flexibility in today's statutory authority.
I think it does have a lot of flexibility. You also, as you know, being an administrator, you ask yourself, well, who else is going to look at that, right? And if somebody else is going to look at plant roots in the agriculture department, but not from a carbon perspective, well, then maybe we should jump in, because if you look at it from a carbon perspective, it deals with the environment. We deal with the environment and energy. So I guess we just say we're going to do it. If somebody else was doing it with a more clear statutory mandate, maybe just as a practical matter, we'd back off and go after something else.
Yeah.
But we've got
I would say, sorry, go ahead, Lane.
Yeah, we've got 2 ag programs and a, what was the other one you were talking about? Cooling?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Well, I would say
engineering
was kind of what I was getting at on that one, which is obviously a subject of some controversy.
Right.
We're really interested in steel, decarbonizing steel production at Breakthrough and decarbonizing concrete and cement production, which are huge emitters, right? They're the two of the largest emitters in the world. And there aren't meaningful dedicated programs funding innovation in those areas in this country today. And so that's a white space and a need. And, perhaps it's white space is kind of the magic word for RPE. And I think for folks like us is doing things, going where the puck is going to, make the puck go where it should go, and so those areas where we would be we are in such strong, like the most brilliant innovators around the country really can't work on steel and cement or concrete unless there's funding to do it, right?
One fellow to do both.
Yes, that's right. And I think that, these are incredibly important questions. And one of the things that, obviously we've been talking a lot about technological innovation, but there's also organizational innovation. And RPE is an example of that, innovating for supporting of innovation. We had a question that came in from Mike Perry. When RPE is successful, the energy landscape is transformed. This should be result in DOE being transformed as well. So how has RPE impacted DOE outside of RPE is a question. I'd ask you, Dave, when you last left RPE to go join and run EERE, did you take any lessons with you to think about how you ran another office at the Department of Energy?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that was having, been one of the first folks at RPE and then gone to EERE, there was a big question in my mind of what are the respective identities of these organizations? So the applied programs versus RPE. And what's really important, I think, is that EERE and the applied programs should not be or try to be RPE, right? That is absolutely critical. And I think that some people felt like they should be when I was doing this. But it became very clear to me that the right relationship is that the applied programs are focusing on long-term, well-defined, very aggressive desired outcomes for the country, right? Let's say, a battery for electric vehicles that costs $50 per kilowatt hours and can take per kilowatt hour and can take the vehicle, 500 miles, and then builds a comprehensive set of activities and programs over the course of a decade or more to try to help to work with industry to get to an outcome that the country and the industry wouldn't have gotten to by itself. And so I think that's a unique mandate that the applied programs have, whereas RPE should be trying to blow up that roadmap, finding something completely off roadmap, accelerating that roadmap by a decade. And then I think the important thing is that the stuff that RPE does that shows great promise, and that the applied programs kind of bring those in as they become real to help them achieve those kind of accelerated goals or achieve those goals in a more cost efficient fashion. And then also, I think equally important, but perhaps harder, is to actually, where there's white space, build new completely new programs within the applied area. And for example, a good example that today might be long duration storage, where ARPA-E did this DAYS program, which has funded a dozen really exciting companies, including a couple that we're working with. But but just by virtue of the budget cycle and inertia, I think within the applied programs, I don't think we have a meaningful long duration, like multi-day weeks, a grid storage program within the applied programs yet. And I think we need to Mike's point, we need to be getting ahead of the curve and having the applied programs get into their budgets, meaningful support to pick up some of these things that become real when ARPA-E turns them into something. And then I think when I went to EERE, a lot of what I did to port the ARPA-E work in was just about the that similar focus that ARPA-E has on talent, world-class talent from all around the country, and bringing them in, complementing folks who, bringing in folks from the industry and the innovation community to work alongside the phenomenal kind of long-term federal workforce, to be very efficient in all of your processes, which, as Lane said, is kind of a constant battle for any organization within the federal government, including ARPA-E in year 10. I facetiously say that every 10 years they should probably, break down, remove all the processes and reinstate them in new form for ARPA-E and other federal agencies, because then you can just start over and strip off all that bureaucracy, right? And when we started ARPA-E, we were like, oh wow, we're nimble and we're doing it right, and we're innovating on process, and then every year, when something happens that draws attention of folks in the Congress or the secretary, or who is it, that something maybe went a little quote unquote wrong, then the answer is, okay, I'm going to put in a new process to make sure that never happens again. And so I think stripping, I just wanted to triple click on the importance of, especially for ARPA-E, stripping away the bureaucracy and doing it ruthlessly, relentlessly. And I think Lane has really pushed on that.
To that point, William O. Douglas, when he was a Supreme Court judge, before he went on there, he was the SEC commissioner. And he wrote in a book, Go East, Young Man, that of his experiences on Wall Street and then going on to the SEC and then onto the court. And one of the things he said was that 10 years is exactly the point where agencies tend to become self-sustaining rather than innovating. And this is back he wrote this in the 30s or the 40s. And he said he thought that, of course, he was a dramatic guy. He thought everything should be blown up and a new agency be authorized at the end of 10 years. But I found, just coming in here the last couple of years, I've heard we never do it that way. You can't do that. And I'm a lawyer, so I'm rules governed. I always say, okay, fine, bring it in and show it to me. And if you can't show it to me in writing, we're going to do it. That's easy. That's easy to you break a few eggs, and you go to lunch alone a lot. But the way to do it is just to say, if you say it's never been done before, show me why, make me the argument, show me where it's written, and show me why it doesn't work in this case. And if it doesn't work like that, well, you just shove it aside and do it your way.
Well, besides the fact that I do think we're all eating lunch alone a lot these days, I know we're getting towards the end of the time, and I want to turn back to you guys for some closing thoughts. And the question I want to ask both of you is, highlighting the fact that there will be a new director eventually of ARPA-E. I know it takes a little bit of time to appoint and get somebody in this chair, as Lane experienced. But what is the advice that you two plan on giving that person when they're getting prepared to run ARPA-E? So I'll turn to you first, Lane. What is the advice you'd give to the next director of ARPA-E?
Flat organization, not only in the org chart, but also in the mandates that you get from Congress. And you should not feel there's anything you can't do unless someone demonstrates to you that it's prohibited. and you should be you should think expansively when it comes to propositions from scientists as to what can be done. I authorized 2 fusion programs this year with Scott Sue to the tune of around $80 million. And I feel, and he had an innovative idea. He wanted to approach building the fireplace, if you will, before the fire was lit. Because he said otherwise, when you approach things in a serial way in this business, you can take 100 years until you get a fusion plant. And I think don't listen to anyone say no, and every day be in a hurry. Because the first speech I made, and this will be quick, I made it with Jenny Gerby, who was now the director of technology. And I said, look, I was there for 2 weeks, I think. And I said, there's money to be had. So if you think you've got a good idea and you need a little more money to make it happen a little faster, you're not going to be the first person or the last person that cures our climate problem, but you're part of the process. And as a consequence, speed matters. So do your work carefully. But when you trade off money versus speed, spend the money and get the speed. We're in a hurry to fix the environment. So get on
it. And Addison, I'm happy to take a crack at that myself. I think if I could summarize it, some of you may know Arthi Prabhakar, who was a DARPA director, great human and a phenomenal leader and innovator. And I remember when she went into DARPA, her motto was something along the lines of "Let DARPA be DARPA." And I think I would say the same thing to any prospective RPE directors: is let RPE be RPE, right? And what does that mean? It means hire phenomenal people and give them a lot of flexibility. And I think stay problem focused, not solution focused, is maybe another dimension that I might throw in there. And I'd say be relentless about recruiting great people, getting barriers out of their way, and and stripping down bureaucracy to the absolute bare minimum. And I think great things continue to happen for RPE.
Well, Dave, Lane, thank you both for joining me today. This has been a great conversation about a very important agency at the Department of Energy. And thank you to the audience for submitting your questions and for taking the time to think about this. I think we're in a great place. And just to reiterate, certainly speed matters, and it's a challenge that we're all going to be working on for the next couple of decades. So thank you again from the Bipartisan Policy Center.